Thank you very much. We'll now move to Mr. Taylor from UCLA. Welcome.
Thank you very much, Chairman Wiener and members of the committee. It's always an honor to speak to the legislature. I've been asked to just give an overview of sort of the state of transit finance and ridership at a pretty high level. I'm going to do that. I just want to say at the outset that there was a lot of discussion, really interesting discussions beginning related to land use, housing, public transit. I just want you to know that we're doing research on that at the Institutes of Transportation Studies, and while that's not part of what I'm doing here, we're glad to provide information relative to that should you have an interest. So I want to begin with three things about public transit finance, and this is sort of broadly over a long period of time. And the first is that really no two agencies are alike. And what I mean by that is that if you look at school districts or some mosquito abatement districts, they're often going to have a similar set of funding sources. Transit is unique in that each transit agency can have wildly different sets of revenue sources that come from local county sales tax measures, from various cities that provide parking revenues, their eligibility for federal funding, so that it's really uneven, and it's very hard to generalize about the financial state of any one agency. The second thing is that fare box recovery has been sliding for over a century. Leading up to World War II, most transit systems were private for-profit enterprises, and most of them paid for all of their capital and operating out of the fare box. And over time, as it's moved into public ownership and we have larger social goals for transit, the fare box recovery has been declining. So while we have had a drop in fare box recovery since the pandemic, it's not like it's unprecedented. This is something that's been going on for quite a while. And again, that level of fare box recovery varies a lot from agency to agency. And third is that in general, it's much easier politically and popular with voters to fund capital investments in public transit than operations and maintenance. It's just human nature that people like ribbon cutting ceremonies, they like new projects, and that paying for repairing buses or rolling ephemeral service out on the street tends to struggle more for funding. So in general, especially at the federal level and at the local level with sales taxes, that's very capital oriented, and often operators are going hungry for operating and maintenance funds when there can be plenty of capital funds available. Now, turning to the next page, public transit in California since the 1990s. One is that we have to step back and say the state has made big bets on transit. And a lot of it has been through the county sales tax measures around the state. But through a variety of programs, the federal capital program, we've done a lot to improve transit since the 1990s. We really have. We've expanded rail transit significantly. Bus service has expanded. We have better ADA service for those with disabilities. A lot of things have improved, and it's important to acknowledge that. From the 1990s into about the Great Recession, we were seeing a gradual growth in ridership statewide. Now, it varied again from operator to operator, but things were on the upswing in terms of use of public transit. It's really been a rocky road since then. The Great Recession really set ridership back. Things tumbled a bit, which is very common. Transit ridership tends to be more sensitive to economic fluctuations than driving, for example. And so things popped down. It started back up. But then some issues resulted. And here, if you turn to the next page 4, you see the same graph that we just saw in the previous presentation, which is that slide down from about fiscal year 2014. During that period, it was actually the star of the state was BART. BART was actually adding riders during this time. And it's really important to think about this in terms of two markets for transit that exist. One are people who, because of age, income, or ability, don't have the ability to drive. They don't have access to a car. They're not physically able to drive a car. They depend on transit for mobility. The second are people who are traveling to places where parking is difficult or expensive. So these are downtowns, downtown San Francisco, universities, airports, places like that. These two fundamental markets. Prior to the pandemic, it was really that first group, the people who have limited auto access, who were causing a lot of this erosion. And how was that happening? It was two ways. One, it was that auto ownership was going up across the income spectrum, but it was really affecting lower income households. You were having fewer zero-vehicle households, more people were moving in having at least one vehicle, other households were adding 2 vehicles. So to go to the senator's point is that you had lots of people who might have been riding 25 times a week. Now we're in a household where there was maybe a car available. They're still riding, but they're riding 5 or 7 times a week. Now, the number of riders didn't change, but ridership dropped a lot as a result of that. And that's kind of what was going on. At the same time, we were actually seeing a growth in people traveling to those places where parking was difficult and expensive. San Francisco, downtown San Francisco was really the shining star for the whole state with that, but you saw it in San Diego and other places. So that you had more people who had cars available, but were traveling into big office centers, were doing more commute-oriented services, and we saw those kinds of services rising. So we had essentially a decline in the relative share of lower-income riders and an increase in the relative share of higher income, more resourced ridership. That script flipped in the pandemic. In the pandemic, those lower income riders still were riding, or to some extent, and have come back pretty well. But you saw a real big decline of those people who were traveling to those places, to the office, and going in twice a week rather than 5 times a week. So the composition of these declines really varied by those two. Okay, turning to the next page, what we can see is a lot of it reflects what kind of a transit system had which mix of those two kinds of riders, helps to explain whether they've recovered most of their riders or partially. So you can see San Diego MTS at the top has recovered pretty much all of its riders, and in fact has exceeded that for some months last year, where BART is really below about half of their riders. And again, a very large share of BART's ridership into and out of downtown San Francisco, big decline in the amount of the density of workers in that, and that helps to explain those big differences. If you go to the next page, we can see that we had this pandemic collapse. It's recovered unevenly. In general, systems today that serve a larger share of lower income and transit-reliant riders have tended to recover more of their riders and are doing better in terms of ridership and typically financially. And commute-oriented systems, again, those that are centered on those downtowns, those other big job centers, have tended to struggle more to win back riders because they're just not traveling to those centers as frequently. So likewise, buses have tended to recover more riders than rail, not because they have rubber tires versus steel wheels, but the nature of the networks and the kinds of service that they provide. Okay, the rail tends to be more commute-oriented. If you turn to page 7, you can see that the systems statewide that have recovered the fewest riders are not all just commute-oriented services, but the ones that are down most since the pandemic are Caltrain in the Bay Area, Metrolink in Southern California, both commuter rail systems, and then BART, which is a mix of a heavy rail urban system and sort of a commuter rail hybrid. And those systems are still there because their markets have changed pretty dramatically. So if we go to the next page, we can see that these systems are tending to struggle more with riders, often are in the worst shape or the most difficult shape with respect to finances. They're most likely facing financial cliffs, and that's because they tended to fund more of their operations out of the fare box than other kinds of riders. To go to page 9, you can see on the I won't say X and Y axis, on the vertical axis is state support. And you can see OCTA over there in Orange County, and then on the horizontal axis is the amount of income that supports the operations, and that you can see that Caltrain's is out over 75%. Yes.
Yeah, I think this is a really important issue, fare box recovery. And I remember I am often wrong, but sometimes I'm right. And one of those areas before the pandemic, I used to get into arguments with some of the transit operators in the Bay Area that were extremely high fare box recovery, 70, 80%, because they would brag about it. Like, this is something that we're so proud of, that we have 75% fare box recovery. And I would say, no, that is an indication of societal failure, that we are not adequately funding these systems out of tax dollars, and that means that you will have continual pressure to raise fares to have increased funding, because that's how you fund yourself. And lo and behold, now we have this situation where high fare box recovery has been the most disastrous. And when you look at other countries that have very successful transit systems and have low fares, the fares are low, and they use tax dollars, and frankly, they give the transit systems more real estate ability to basically generate revenue for the systems. Can you? That's at least my perception. Can you just comment on that, just in terms of how we?
I can't. Permission to go slightly nerdy here?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. So we do an odd thing in the U.S. in that we silo capital funding and operations and maintenance funding. And so because of that, when we say fare box recovery, we're talking about a share of operating costs that are paid for out of the fare box. We ignore all of the capital costs. So if you look at these high fare box recovery systems, they tend to be rather capital intensive systems. So if we actually amortized all of that capital and incorporated it in, to a taxpayer, a dollar's a dollar. They don't care whether it's categorized as capital or operating. And in many other parts of the world, they just amortize all their costs and account it that way. So we would see actually less of a spread here.
Right.
You're right in the extent that they often have fares, but what they've done is they have urban environments that have been carefully curated to be so congruent with transit use. Even with relatively low fares, they get significant revenues from the fare box, but it's a lot of people paying a relatively small amount. So you can't say that they're just uniformly low fare box systems. In some Eastern European, they've gone fare free. That's a different story. But in general, the way you're describing this is correct, except I would say that the one thing missing here is that we're really excluding all of the capital. So a bus system is going to be less capital intensive because its right-of-way is essentially roads that are paid for by other sources, where rail systems have to pay for their own right-of-way as well as the vehicles, which tend to be more expensive. So if we amortize that over time and depreciate it and incorporate that in, we get a very different picture. We just don't do that in the way that we organize funds here.
Sure, but the capital is also very variable.
Yeah, that's my point. So those three systems that have the red circle around them, those are all really capital-intensive systems. So you can think of it as that they've pushed more cost into the capital part. They have relatively less labor going for it because you essentially have one train operator that can do a 10-car train versus multiple bus operators, so labor costs are much higher. Speeds tend to be lower, so you tend to have a lot more labor costs in a bus system, which means they have relatively more operating costs per passenger, but they have much fewer capital costs per passenger. That's just my point in the distinction. But I think your point, which is if we're reliant on fare box recovery, that makes us that makes systems vulnerable to changes in patronage, and that's absolutely correct.
And puts pressure on raising fares because that's the main way that they get money on a year in, year out basis. Like if for example Muni gets significant funding from the San Francisco General Fund, so the fare box recovery is much lower for Muni than it is for BART or Caltrain, and so Muni has not had the same pressures in terms of continually raising fares. For BART and Caltrain are expensive. They're expensive systems for people to ride, and it's not a criticism. That's how they are able to generate more funds. But that's to me, one of the downsides of having that higher fare box recovery.
I would agree with that, but I would also note that the average household income of a BART or Caltrain rider is significantly higher than of an AC Transit rider or a Muni rider. So that in a sense, the variance in the fares is somewhat progressive, but that's...
I wouldn't say, not for BART. BART has a significant low-income ridership, I think. But
they do, and especially post-pandemic.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Another question,
Yes.
Mr. Chair, if I could. In assessing the operational results, shall we say, the profit and loss of transit systems, does that include amortization of capital costs, or is it only variable operational costs?
When we're talking about things like fare box recovery, we're talking about only operations and maintenance costs.
Right, but in the assessment of the performance of transit systems, in other words, when they're looking at their own financial results and assessing that, is it only revenue less operational costs, or is it revenue less operational costs and amortization of capital?
It typically doesn't include amortization of capital. And the argument that the operators would give you, which is that most of the funding that goes for capital is earmarked specifically for capital, so there's no option to make shifts between capital investments and operations. Since it's earmarked, they don't have any capacity to make any sort of changes like that, so they tend to focus on on the operating costs. But in general, you make a good point, is that for decision makers, it would be good to look at the fully amortized.
The reason I asked the question is because this came up in our progress report relative to high-speed rail about a year ago, and it was news to me as I reviewed the information leading up to the testimony that in terms of assessing in forecasting the operations, that there was no mention of capital costs. And so I raised the question, since the proposition that initially authorized the system required that the system be self-sustaining, that if you're eliminating capital costs, then you're not really assessing self-sustaining. And I was told, well, that's typical in public transit. It's not typical in accounting generally. So in terms of assessing the true results of transit systems, whether it be high-speed rail or Caltrain or these regionally based and community-based transit systems, you're really not assessing the true financial results, the ability to cover both operational costs as well as capital costs. Just a comment on part of this particular bean counter.
Yeah, so that is right, but we also tend not to count what we'd call external costs. So that there are lots of things that there are external costs and benefits that are really important to calculations, especially in the public sector, that we'd want to pay attention to. And we talk about things like emissions and a variety of things like that, that when we account for that, we could get slightly different measures as well. But you raise a good point, but I think there's a whole set in the public sector of ways that we'd account costs that would be useful and informative. And I think that that not accounting for sort of negative external costs, for example, of trucking relative to rail freight and things like that is really important to do as well. So there's quite a bit in that, but I don't want to digress too far from this. So let me just move on for 1 second here. So if we look at page 10. You can see again that it really has varied from operator to operator how much this is a measure of funds that come from income, which is usually counted as fare and other directly revenue sources like advertising and things like that. And you can see that those high fare box recovery systems, and I put an arrow there for BART, for Metrolink, and for Caltrain, you can see the biggest drop, but it's a drop for every system, but at different levels in terms of how they were affected. So I think the lesson from this is that there has been this general post-pandemic effect. It's varied dramatically from operator to operator. And then the last thing I wanted to mention is that just as it's hard to characterize the funding of any individual transit system, it's hard to characterize the funding that each state does to support transit. Some of them provide significant support, but mostly for capital again. Others have big operating support programs. What we've done here is shown the 5 largest states in terms of unlinked passenger trips in those states, not riders, but actually unlinked passenger trips. And you can see that California is at the low end in terms of the support of operating, with Massachusetts and Pennsylvania.
Yeah, so just to be clear, this is a really important slide. It's page 11, slide 11. You look at Massachusetts, Pennsylvania, New York, just dramatically higher levels of support than California. It's just a really important slide.
I would note one other thing here is that many people are surprised to learn that there are actually more trips on yellow school buses nationwide than there are on all public transit systems combined. And California is near the bottom of the country in terms of financial support of yellow school bus service as well. So in terms of overall support of what you could call transit service broadly, California is if we were to combine that, would be even lower than this.
Yeah, and we see that play out at school sites when neighbors get really unhappy that tons of people are just like double parking and dropping their kids off. Great, and we'll need to wrap up this panel soon.
Yes, so just the last slide is number 12, is that California ridership has been lagging not just since the pandemic, but since the Great Recession. The effects on transit ridership and on fare revenues were dramatic and are still ongoing. These ridership and fiscal effects do not affect all transit systems equally, and it's really important to recognize that. Some are really facing fiscal cliffs, others are doing okay. No one wants to say, yeah, we're in great shape, but they're doing okay. And that California generally supports transit operations less than other high transit use states nationwide. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much to both of you.